There exists, etched into human psychology like a scar that never fully heals, a profound inability to abandon that in which we have already invested, a stubbornness disguised as virtue, an irrationality that dresses itself in the noble clothes of perseverance. This is the sunk cost fallacy, the cognitive error that transforms small losses into total catastrophes, that keeps us investing in doomed projects simply because we have already invested too much to stop. It is not the lost money that destroys us. It is the inability to accept that it is lost. The obstinate refusal to recognize that the past cannot be recovered through future sacrifices. We throw good money after bad, invest additional years in failed relationships, keep moribund businesses on life support, all because the whispering voice in our minds insists that quitting now would mean all the previous investment was in vain. But this voice lies. The previous investment is already in vain the moment the project fails, and continuing only transforms partial loss into total loss, only adds more fuel to the fire already consuming our capital. This is the fable of the ship that could not return, a story carved in shipwreck wood about a captain who confused obstinacy with courage and paid the highest price the seas can demand. On the docks of Portus, where ships of all kinds were built by master craftsmen whose families had shaped wood into vessels for countless generations, lived a man named Argos, a middle-aged captain with eyes that seemed always fixed on horizons others could not see. Argos had spent his youth sailing as first mate on merchant ships, learning the routes, studying the winds, accumulating not just nautical knowledge, but a specific obsession that gradually consumed his entire being. He had heard stories, read fragmentary accounts in ancient manuscripts, studied faded maps that pointed to a legendary island known only as the Spice Island, a place supposedly laden with riches so vast that a single cargo would transform any common man into a magnate beyond imagination. Most experienced navigators dismissed these stories as fantasy, myths perpetuated by drunken sailors and fanciful cartographers. But Argos believed. More than that, he had built his entire identity, his entire sense of purpose, around the conviction that he would be the captain who finally reached this island, who would prove the skeptics wrong, who would return laden with spices and glory, sufficient to ensure his name in the annals of maritime history. With this vision consuming him completely, Argos made the decision that would define and ultimately destroy his life. He would invest everything, absolutely everything, in building a ship specifically designed for this singular expedition. He sold the modest house he had inherited from his parents, liquidated all his savings accumulated during decades of careful work, and when this was not enough, he mortgaged his family's future, taking loans against properties he did not yet own, against profits from a voyage he had not yet made. The total cost, even before the keel was laid, was astronomical, representing not just his present wealth, but years of future earnings already committed. And with these resources, he hired the best shipbuilders, specified the finest materials, oak from the northern forests, sails of the most resistant linen, ropes braided with techniques that guaranteed durability in tempestuous seas. He equipped the ship, which he christened Perseverance, with maps, navigation instruments, supplies for a journey of months, and a carefully selected crew of loyal men willing to follow his vision. When the Perseverance was finally launched to sea in a ceremony that all of Portus witnessed, it was a masterpiece of naval engineering, and Argos was a man who had invested not just his fortune, but his very soul in that wooden hull. This is the first stage of the sunk cost fallacy, the massive initial investment that creates a psychological anchor so heavy it becomes almost impossible to lift. Argos had not simply purchased a ship, he had transformed his entire life into a singular bet, had burned all bridges that might allow retreat, had publicly announced his mission so that success or failure would be known by everyone who knew him. His ego, his identity, his sense of himself as a man of vision and courage, all of this was now welded to the fate of the Perseverance. And the greater the initial investment, the deeper the commitment, the more psychologically impossible it becomes to abandon the project even when evidence accumulates suggesting it is doomed. Argos departed amid applause and promises, with flags fluttering and bells ringing, conscious that his reputation, everything he had worked for and sacrificed, was now tied to that ship, sailing toward a destiny he believed would be glorious. but which would be revealed as something very different. Aboard the Perseverance was a young navigator named Darius, a 28-year-old man with formal education in nautical astronomy and modern cartography, someone who trusted instruments and updated data more than legends and ancient maps. Darius had been hired by Argos for his technical expertise, but from the beginning, he had harbored private doubts about the mission. He had studied the most recent commercial reports, had conversed with merchants returning from distant lands, and all the evidence he could gather suggested that the spice market had fundamentally changed. New, shorter, and safer. Routes had been discovered in recent years. Alternative suppliers had emerged. And as for the legendary Spice Island that Argos pursued, the most reliable accounts indicated that, if it existed at all, it was surrounded by treacherous reefs and frequently harassed by pirates who made any attempt at trade extremely dangerous. But when Darius tried to share these concerns with Argos during preparations, the captain had dismissed his warnings as unjustified pessimism, as lack of faith, as the kind of timid doubt that prevented common men from achieving great deeds. Argos had invested too much, sacrificed too much, to allow inconvenient data to disturb his conviction. Darius, needing the employment and recognizing the futility of arguing with a man so deeply committed, had reluctantly agreed to serve as navigator, secretly hoping that perhaps Argos was right, that perhaps faith could somehow overcome probabilities. The first weeks of the voyage passed well enough. The Perseverance was indeed a magnificent ship, responding to currents and winds with the grace of an expertly built vessel. The crew was in good spirits, excited by the adventure, by the possibility of wealth, by the charisma of a captain who believed so absolutely in his mission. But then, approximately a month after departure, when they were already too far from Portus to return easily, they encountered another ship, a merchant vessel called Aurora, returning from eastern waters. The two captains performed the traditional courtesy of exchanging news and information, and it was during this conversation that Argos received the first concrete evidence that his mission might be doomed. The captain of the Aurora, an experienced man with scars that mapped a life at sea, told Argos about the Spice Island. It existed, he confirmed, but not as legend promised. The spices had been depleted years ago due to overexploitation. What remained was a deadly trap. Submerged reefs that tore holes, treacherous currents that dragged ships onto shoals, and a confederation of pirates who had established a base there precisely because naive ships still tried to reach the island based on outdated maps. 3 ships had sunk there in just the last year. The captain of the Aurora begged Argos to reconsider, to return, while he still had ship and crew intact. Darius, hearing this account, felt his stomach tighten with validated fear. He immediately sought out Argos in the captain's cabin, bringing with him the updated map that the captain of the Aurora had offered. A document that clearly showed the dangers, that marked with red X the location of known shipwrecks, that offered alternative routes to safe ports where they could sell the ship and its supplies with minimal loss. Darius argued with all the logic he possessed. The cost of continuing was probable total loss. The cost of returning was only the time and supplies already spent. Resources that were lost anyway, that could not be recovered regardless of the decision they made now. The only rational question was, which path minimized additional future losses? Returning would save the ship, the crew, and allow Argos to restructure his debts, perhaps find employment as captain on more conventional voyages. Continuing risked everything in pursuit of a destination that reliable evidence indicated was illusory or inaccessible. For Darius, the choice was obvious, but he was not accounting for the massive psychological power of sunk cost. Argos' almost physical inability to abandon an investment in which he had placed not just money, but identity, purpose, existential meaning. Argos looked at the map, at the red X's marking shipwrecks, at the warnings written in ink that had not yet fully dried, and then he tore the map in half, then in quarters, then into pieces so small they could no longer be read. His face was contorted not just with anger, but with something deeper, something close to the panic of a man confronting the possibility that he had made a catastrophic mistake. To return, he shouted at Darius, would be to throw away the entire investment, to waste the years spent planning this expedition, the months building the Perseverance, the fortune spent on equipment and crew. He had mortgaged his house, had promised investors, had publicly announced his mission. What kind of man would return now, admitting failure, accepting loss, proving all the skeptics right? The reputation he would lose, the humiliation he would face, the recognition that he had bet everything and lost, all of this was too unbearable to contemplate. And beyond this, he had invested so much, sacrificed so much, that surely the universe owed him some return. Surely his dedication would be rewarded. The cold logic that Darius presented completely ignored the emotional and psychological dimension of Argos's investment. The sunk cost was not just money. It was identity. It was meaning. It was the very narrative that Argos had constructed about who he was and what his life meant. This is the essence of the sunk cost fallacy. The confusion between past costs that cannot be recovered regardless of future actions, and future costs that can be avoided through present decisions. Argos was committing the fundamental error of thinking that, because he had invested X resources in the project, continuing would somehow honor or justify or recover that investment. But this logic is completely inverted. The resources already invested are lost the moment the project proves unviable. Continuing does not recover them. It only adds more resources to the pile of losses. The rational decision must be purely prospective. Given where we are now, which future path minimizes additional losses and maximizes potential returns? What has already been spent is economically irrelevant to this decision, though it is psychologically dominant. Darius tried to explain this using a simple diagram he drew in the ship's logbook. The sunk cost he drew as a horizontal line, representing money already spent and impossible to recover. The future cost he drew as a vertical line, growing dramatically if they continued on the current course, remaining relatively low if they returned. But Argos could not see the diagram clearly because his vision was obscured by the emotional fog of investment already made. For him, the sunk cost was a weight that demanded vindication, not a fact to be accepted and then ignored in future decision-making. The expedition continued. Argos ordered that they sail toward the Spice Island, dismissing the warnings of the captain of the Aurora as exaggerations of a man who had lost his courage, as disinformation possibly spread by competitors who wanted to keep the spice market to themselves. And as they continued, the cost of continuing began to manifest in concrete and devastating forms. The ship suffered damage in a storm that a more prudent navigator would have avoided by waiting in safe harbor. The repairs required use of precious materials from their limited reserves. The crew, perceiving that the captain was pursuing a possibly suicidal mission against sensible advice, began to become demoralized, and low morale led to sloppy work that caused more problems. Supplies were used more quickly than planned because the route they followed was longer than alternative routes. And each new cost, each new problem, instead of serving as evidence that they should reconsider, was used by Argos as justification to continue. He argued to himself, and to the increasingly skeptical crew, "We cannot return now, for we have just spent our last oak planks repairing the hull. It would be to waste those materials." Or, "We have already traveled so far, already invested so many months, that to quit now would make all the time a waste." This is the spiral of irrationality that the sunk cost fallacy creates. Each new investment in a doomed project becomes justification for additional investment. Each loss becomes reason to risk more in hope of eventually recovering everything. Argos was digging a deeper hole to justify the hole he had already dug, was sinking more capital to validate the capital already sunk. In his personal journal, which he kept meticulously, he wrote entries that revealed not rational analysis, but emotional rationalization. Perseverance is the virtue of great captains. Those who quit midway never achieve greatness. I will not be remembered as the captain who spent a fortune on a magnificent ship only to turn cowardly homeward when the true test of courage arrived. He had completely reinterpreted the situation, transforming what was clearly a recognizable and correctable error in judgment into a test of character, transforming the rational decision to cut losses into moral failure. And the more he invested in this narrative, the more he committed not just resources, but identity to the project, the more psychologically impossible it became to change course. Darius, observing this spiral with growing horror, made one last attempt to reach Argos through the logic of opportunity cost. He explained that the true cost of continuing was not just the additional money and time they would spend pursuing the illusory island, but also the profits they would forego if they returned and invested in viable trade routes. There were, at that very moment, lucrative opportunities in other ports, cargoes that needed transport, safe and established routes where the Perseverance could generate immediate income. Each day spent sailing toward the Spice Island was a day not spent generating return on alternative investments. The true cost of continuing included not just direct future losses, but also sacrificed future gains. But Argos, looking at the horizon where he imagined the island was located, saw these alternative routes not as opportunities, but as distractions, temptations to abandon his manifest destiny, as the kind of small thinking that kept common men trapped in mediocrity. He had invested so much in being the captain who would discover the Spice Island that he could not conceive of himself as the captain who recognized mistakes and corrected them, who chose humility and survival over pride and ruin. His identity was completely fused with the project, and abandoning the project meant, in his mind, abandoning himself. The Perseverance sailed deeper into unknown waters, following outdated maps toward a destination that reliable reports indicated was inaccessible or non-existent. The crew was now openly discontent, murmuring about mutiny, but Argos had become increasingly tyrannical, punishing dissent, silencing doubts, governing through fear instead of respect, because he could not tolerate any more voices questioning the project in which he had invested his entire soul. And then, on a morning when thick fog covered the sea like a shroud, the inevitable result arrived. The ship struck submerged reefs exactly where the captain of the Aurora had warned they would be. The sound of cracking wood was like breaking bones, like the Perseverance itself screaming in agony. Water gushed through the split hull. The ship, that masterpiece of naval engineering in which Argos had invested his fortune and his dreams, began to sink. The crew panicked, struggling to launch lifeboats. Darius ran across the tilting deck shouting orders, trying to save as many men as possible, and Argos stood on the captain's deck, in paralytic shock, watching his entire life disappear beneath waves that showed neither mercy nor judgment, only the cold indifference of physics and reality. They were eventually rescued by a small fishing boat that operated in those waters collecting wood from shipwrecks, a sad but profitable business, given how many ships had met their end on those same reefs. Argos and Darius and the surviving crew members were taken back to a smaller port, not Portus, but an unknown coastal town where no one knew their stories, no one knew of their ambitions. They sat on the dock, watching the horizon where the Perseverance had sunk, visible now only as memory and loss. Argos held a piece of wood from the ship, a fragment of the railing he had personally polished during construction, and his hands trembled not from cold, but from belated recognition of everything he had destroyed through his inability to abandon a sunk cost. Darius, sitting beside him, offered no recriminations because there was no need. The lesson had been taught by reality more brutally than any words could achieve. He spoke softly, more to himself than to Argos. The ship sank. The total cost was loss of everything. If we had returned when the captain of the Aurora warned us, we would have lost what we had already spent, but we would have saved the ship, the crew, the future. The sunk cost led us from partial loss to total loss. You were not defeated by the sea, Captain. You were defeated by a number, by your inability to accept that the money already spent was lost regardless of our future actions. Argos never sailed again. He had no capital for another ship, no reputation to attract investors, no longer the arrogance that had allowed him to believe vision could overcome reality. He spent his remaining years working on the docks of Portus, having finally returned to the city he had left, with such fanfare, a broken man teaching lessons he had learned through catastrophic loss. Young aspiring captains sometimes sought him out for advice, and he always told them the same thing. True perseverance is not blind stubbornness on a path that has proven wrong, but courage to constantly reevaluate, humility to recognize mistakes early, wisdom to distinguish between recoverable and irrecoverable costs. The money you have already spent is lost. This is a painful but inescapable truth. Continuing to invest in a failed project does not recover the initial investment. It only transforms partial loss into total loss, only adds more victims to the original sacrifice. The correct decision is always based on prospective analysis. Given where I am now, which future path offers the best risk-adjusted returns? What I have already spent is irrelevant to this decision, except as a lesson about what to avoid repeating. He had paid the highest possible price to learn this lesson, and he dedicated the rest of his life to trying to spare others this same fate. This is the sunk cost fallacy as it manifests in financial markets, in business ventures, in investment decisions of all kinds. How many times have you bought more shares of a declining company because I've already invested so much in it that I can't stop now? How many times have you kept a failing business running, bleeding capital month after month, because I've dedicated years to building it and I can't just give up? How many times have you remained in an investment that all data indicated was doomed, simply because recognizing the loss and selling would mean admitting that all the money invested previously was wasted? The sunk cost fallacy leads us to 3 destructive errors. First, we continue investing additional resources in losing assets, throwing good money after bad in increasingly desperate attempts to justify the initial investment. Second, we remain trapped in old and failed projects, losing the time and capital that could be repurposed into new and promising opportunities, sacrificing future returns to validate past expenditures. Third, we confuse partial loss with total loss, preferring the illusion that the investment can still recover instead of accepting partial loss now, and reallocating remaining capital to more productive uses. The conceptual solution to the sunk cost fallacy is simple to state, but extraordinarily difficult to implement emotionally. You must rigorously separate the past from the future in your decision-making. The money you have already spent is lost, completely lost, irrecoverably lost. This is a painful but liberating truth, because once you accept that that money is lost regardless of your future actions, you can stop allowing it to influence future decisions. The only question that matters is perspective. Given where I am now, with the resources I still possess, which investment of future capital and time offers the best expected returns? Implement this rigorous mental test. If you had invested nothing in this asset, if you were evaluating it for the first time today with fresh eyes and no emotional history, would you buy it at the current price with its current characteristics? If the answer is no, then you should not hold it either, because holding and buying are economically equivalent, both representing the decision to allocate capital to this asset instead of alternatives. The fact that you already own the asset, that you have already invested in it, is psychologically powerful but economically irrelevant. Define clear exit rules based on objective criteria, not on your emotional attachment to the initial investment. Use stop-loss orders that automatically liquidate positions when they reach predetermined loss levels. Establish performance milestones that, if not met, trigger mandatory reevaluation and possible exit. Create decision-making systems that force prospective analysis and explicitly prohibit references to historical costs as justifications for future action. And perhaps most importantly, cultivate the psychological capacity to accept losses, to recognize errors, to change course without seeing this as character failure, but as demonstration of flexibility and rationality. True courage is not in blindly persevering on the path you initially chose, regardless of evidence that you are wrong. True courage is in having the humility to constantly reevaluate, the honesty to recognize when you have made a mistake, the wisdom to cut losses before they become catastrophic, the strength to turn the helm, even when this means admitting you sailed in the wrong direction. Captain Argos did not fail because he chose the wrong destination initially. He failed because he could not change destinations when clear evidence indicated his course was disastrous. He confused persistence with wisdom, confused irrecoverable investment with justified future commitment. Do not be Captain Argos. Do not sink your ship defending a course that the data clearly shows is doomed. Sunk costs are real, they are painful, they are humiliating to acknowledge, but they are finite. You lost X money or Y time. This is a defined loss. What the sunk cost fallacy does is transform this finite loss into infinite loss. Continue adding more capital to the original sacrifice. Transform correctable error into irreversible catastrophe. Learn the crucial difference between wise perseverance, which constantly reevaluates and remains committed because analysis indicates the path is still sound, and destructive stubbornness, which remains committed simply because it has already invested too much to consider alternatives. The market, like the ocean, does not care about your hopes, does not honor your past sacrifices, does not reward persistence disconnected from reality. The market rewards those who can see clearly, decide rationally, adapt quickly. Release your anchor to the past. Accept that what was lost is lost. And with the resources that remain, with the capital you still possess, sail toward not the destination you once imagined, but the destination that present analysis indicates is achievable and valuable. This is the wisdom that separates those who survive long-term from those who, like Argos, watch their ships sink while defending decisions they should have abandoned much earlier. Subscribe to discover how to free yourself from the chains of the past, to learn the fables that illuminate not the investments we made, but the decisions we can still make.